Actors and writers remain on strike, but is there a light at the end of the tunnel? I've got a full strike update right now. Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell and welcome to this video which will serve as an update to the ongoing strikes that are happening right now in Hollywood. The Writers Guild of America has been on strike for 95 days. The Actors Guild, SAG-AFTRA, has now been on strike for 23 days, so they've been on the picket lines together for a little over 3 weeks, and we have a lot to cover. I haven't done a strike update video in a while because there really hasn't been any new news. Nobody's been at the table. Nothing's really happened since SAG-AFTRA called their strike just over 3 weeks ago, but there is actually a lot to go over today. First of all, the ramifications of the actors' strike. So we're going to talk about all of the delays that have already cropped up because of the actors' strike. We're also going to talk about exactly what the actors asked the AMPTP for. The AMPTP is the Guild of Producers with which the actors are negotiating. We'll also see what the AMPTP says they offered, so it's a bit of a they said as far as what's on the table. We're going to discuss some problems that have come up since the SAG-AFTRA strike started, including a controversy about tree trimming and some real questions that people right here on YouTube had about what they could or could not do. And we're also going to talk about a potential breakthrough as writers and producers are slated this week to sit down at the negotiating table and talk things over for the first time since the writers went on strike back in May. So let's get started first of all, as I said, with the immediate consequences of the actors' strike, which has been going on for just over 3 weeks. One of the things that actors are prohibited from doing while they're on strike, unless they can get some kind of an interim agreement, which we'll discuss in length in a few minutes, is promoting movies. They can't go out there, they can't do interviews, they can't do funny viral things, and this has had immediate ramifications in the form of movie release delays. One of the most immediate delays is Problemista, which was supposed to come out this Friday, but has now been pushed to a TBD release date. It's a bit of an interesting case because Problemista is from A24. A24 is a studio that is not part of the AMPTP. We'll talk about a few of their projects that have gotten approval for work to continue, but the director-writer of the film, Julio Torres, announced his decision to delay the film until after the strike out of solidarity. It's one of a handful of cases where perhaps production or promotion could have continued on a film, but someone involved said that they were not going to do that because of the ongoing strike. Sony's Gran Turismo was supposed to open next Friday, but it is not going to have a wide opening now until August 25th for a combination of reasons. Number one, to give Barbie and Oppenheimer a little more time at the box office, and also because they can't do the big promotional push, so the wide date for Gran Turismo will now be August 25th. White Bird, A Wonder Story. This movie had already been pushed from a planned release last fall. It has now been pushed from its August 25th date to a TBD date in the fourth quarter of this year. Yorgos Lanthimos' latest film, Poor Things, which is considered to be a potential awards frontrunner starring Emma Stone, was delayed from its September 8th release date to December 8th. Challengers, which had already gotten a lot of media buzz, starring Zendaya and directed by Luca Guadagnino, had a buzzy trailer release and was set to be the opening night film at the Venice Film Festival before a theatrical release on September 15th. Challengers has now been pushed out of 2023 completely. It's now scheduled to open on April 26th of next year. The Emmy Awards will not air on September 18th. They are likely to air in January if the strike is resolved, but there's no solid word on when that date will be. Drive Away Dolls, which is directed and co-written by Ethan Coen, one half of the Coen brothers, was set to be released in just a few weeks on September 22nd. That release date has been delayed TBD. Sony had a lot of release date changes that they announced last week, some of them probably related to the strike, many of them perhaps not. Kraven the Hunter is one that is almost absolutely because of the strike. It was delayed nearly a year. It was set to open on October 6th. It will now open next August 18th. The sequel to Ghostbusters Afterlife was on the release schedule for December 20th of this year. It has been now moved to next March 29th. And then Spider-Man Beyond the Spider-Verse. There had already been stories about the huge workload in getting Across the Spider-Verse into theaters. Reportedly, the dialogue for the film had not yet been recorded, or at least had not been finished, and actors cannot do that while they are on strike. And it was already a short turnaround time to get it into theaters before next spring, which was its original release date. It will not be coming out next spring. It has been moved to a TBD release release date, presumably in 2024, perhaps beyond. So if you were hoping to get that second part next spring, that's not going to happen. Andor Season 2 has also stopped filming with SAG-AFTRA cast, which will probably mean a lengthy production delay. I spoke in the last video about the difference between SAG-AFTRA, which is the union for actors that usually operate here out of the United States for US productions, and then Actors in Equity, which is the British version, really, of SAG-AFTRA. Equity is not on strike and actually is not allowed legally to go on strike in solidarity with SAG-AFTRA. So some shows like House of the Dragon that have cast members that work under an equity contract have still been in production, and there are some members of Andor that could do that. However, there are others under a SAG-AFTRA contract that cannot work. So this is a show that already was feeling the effects of the writer's strike when Tony Gilroy had to cease many or all of his duties on the show once his guild went on strike back in May. Now many of the actors are now on strike, so this could likely result in a longer wait for the second season of Andor. One film that has been hotly speculated about is Dune Part 2. Variety reported a couple of weeks ago that Warner Brothers was considering moving it to 2024 because its huge cast would not be available to do promotion if the actor strike was still going on. But the CEO of IMAX has stated that he does not anticipate Dune moving off of his release date, and he said that the IMAX theaters will be there waiting for it for an exclusive run of 2 to 3 weeks and perhaps more. IMAX has even said that they will not show the Marvels in IMAX at all because they will commit to having Dune Part 2 in all of their theaters. So it sounds like there's a muddy picture at best when it comes to the release of Dune Part 2, but according to the sources that I've read, any speculation that it's moving is just speculation, and it seems like at this time that it will be sticking to its release date. So when I did my last video, which was right when the SAG-AFTRA strike began, we didn't know a lot about the specific proposals that had been put on the table. We knew the general issues that everybody was going on strike over, but we had not really heard from SAG-AFTRA exactly what they had proposed to the producers, and we hadn't heard much of anything from the AMPTP. A lot of people said in the last video, well, you only presented SAG-AFTRA's side. Well, that's really the only side that I had any comment about. The last couple of weeks, though, have been very illuminating because we now know not only what SAG-AFTRA proposed to the producers, but we've had statements from the AMPTP saying, well, these were our counter proposals, and this is why we did not feel that we could give the actors what they wanted. So I want to go over some of that. I cannot go over everything. There are a lot of different issues that were part of these negotiations, and it would be a 3-hour video. It would be very technical and going into some things that I don't really know that much about if I was going to go into every single difference between SAG-AFTRA and the AMPTP. But I do feel safe in saying that these are the major issues at hand when we talk about the SAG-AFTRA strike. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of what was on the table. And really one of the great places to start is with artificial intelligence. It is one of the keystone issues in both the writers and the actor strike. So here was what SAG-AFTRA's proposal regarding artificial intelligence was. It was to establish a comprehensive set of provisions to protect work and require informed consent and compensation when a digital replica is made or when voice, likeness, or performance will be substantially changed using AI, basically saying, hey, listen, if you're going to scan an actor to be a digital replica, then you have to tell them that you're doing it. If you're going to use it in a different movie, you have to tell them what that movie is. They have to approve their use in that movie, and you have to compensate them for the use in that movie. And if you are going to alter somebody's performance using AI, either a video or a visual alteration, again, you must go to that actor, get their approval, disclose the nature of that alteration, and compensate them for that. The AMPTP counteroffer reportedly said that digital background replicas would not be allowed below required levels, meaning essentially that they would not replace human extras for all movies, just if there was a certain number of extras that were needed that they could use digitally. The counteroffer also reportedly had a consent and bargaining requirement for use of digital replicas in other projects, and consent and disclosure required for alteration of performance. So some of the things that the actors asked for. SAG-AFTRA says that vital concerns were not addressed, leaving actors vulnerable to being replaced by digital replicas. The AMPTP says that SAG-AFTRA did not respond to their last proposal and that they are requesting a, quote, balanced approach based on careful use, not prohibition. So you can see why the lines are so divided over this issue, because SAG-AFTRA is basically asking for complete prohibition or heavy regulation, and the AMPTP is asking for use with some terms, but also a little bit more latitude. And I understand, because if the actors give too much leeway here, then that could be disastrous for many of their members. However, I have to say, and again, this is according to the various parties, but reading this, the two sides didn't seem as far apart as I thought they were. Certainly not as far apart as the AMPTP and the writers seem to be on AI. So I'm hopeful that maybe they can come up with a code that everybody will agree to that perhaps can get them over this obstacle when it comes to the actor strike. Speaking of background actors, also known as extras, they're also a big part of SAG-AFTRA's proposal to the producers. They're asking for increased wages overall for background actors, 90 minutes pay for actors that are asked to do their own hair and makeup, and that background actors serving as photo doubles for principal actors who deliver dialogue be paid as a principal day player. The AMPTP's counteroffer reportedly was a wage increase from $187 a day to $208 a day, with more increases over the 3-year span of the contract. They also reportedly offered $35 compensation for actors required to do their hair and makeup, and a $150 compensation for actors serving as principal photo doubles for actors and delivering dialogue for actors. SAG-AFTRA says they rejected the $35 hair and makeup fee and that the other terms are under negotiation. The AMPTP says that the overall increase in background actor pay matches SAG-AFTRA's demand for all other actors, that the hair and makeup fee increase equals a 17% increase in the day rate, and that the wage increase for photo doubles equals a 62% increase in the day rate, which is true, but the day rate is also very low. So yes, $35 is an over 10% pay raise, but it's not that much money. Again, this is going to be a game of inches. There's going to be a proposal and a counter proposal, and they're going to come up with a number somewhere in the middle. But this is more of a standard kind of negotiation that you see in these sort of labor disagreements, where they don't really seem to be disagreeing on the principle of the matter. It's more just about the dollars. One of the things coming up in this labor dispute is something that SAG-AFTRA calls geographic discrimination. Basically, they asked the producers for conversations regarding a guarantee that actors based outside of Los Angeles and New York are not paid less for the same roles as actors who are based in LA or New York, basically to address, I think, a complaint from some members of the union that, hey, you know, I live in Chicago or I live in Phoenix and I was offered a lead part in this kind of production and it's 25% below what an actor or in LA or New York is offered, and basically, you know, I'm kind of being paid less because I live outside of the quote-unquote industry and the producers feel like they can pay me less. The AMPTP says that all actors are required to be paid the same minimum rate and that negotiations regarding amounts over that are not subject to collective bargaining. Basically saying like, hey, listen, our job as producers and the AMPTP is to get a minimum pay amount. Anything above that that people want to get paid, that's not up to us. Again, this is one of those things where I could see this being something that SAG-AFTRA drops in negotiations, because it is an issue and I understand the importance of it, but there is also a give and take, and it's not always right that they drop some of these issues, but I could see this geographic discrimination issue as being something that SAG-AFTRA gives ground on in order to accomplish something somewhere else. Something that I don't know they'll drop, though, is something that is called hair and makeup equity. SAG-AFTRA proposed that sets have makeup artists and tools and equipment required to service all cast member ethnicities, including background actors, when it comes to hair and makeup. And they also asked that all cast, including principal cast and background cast, will be able to consult with makeup artists prior to the commencement of work. The AMPTP reportedly counteroffered that the hair and makeup artists and tools would be available on set as requested, but only to principal actors, that if no qualified artist was available to do hair and makeup for a specific actor, that the required services would be reimbursed following a consultation, but they also said that they could not guarantee consultation for background actors. SAG-AFTRA says that all actors must have access to qualified artists with experience in all types of hair and skin tones to ensure equity, and that the AMPTP proposal was not a mandate and not enforceable via arbitration. So basically saying it was only a promise for these things to happen, but that there's really no mechanism for them to go back and make them do it if they didn't do the things that were requested. The AMPTP said that the number of background actors on some shoots made consultations for everybody impossible, and that background actors required to self-style or do their own hair and makeup would receive that proposed $35 increase in pay. Again, this is somewhere where I think they're far apart. You've got an agreement there, it seems, to do it for the principal cast. It's just figuring out for everybody else. And I think that this will probably be negotiated as far as the final settlement. One thing that the actors and the writers also have in common is a minimum pay increase. SAG-AFTRA says they asked for an 11% general wage increase in year one of this new contract, which means that across the board, all actors would get an 11% raise, followed by a 4% raise in year two and a 4% raise in year three. AMPTP counteroffered a 5% general wage increase in year one, a 4% increase in year two, which is what SAG-AFTRA was asking for, and a 3.5% increase in year three. So year two and year three are pretty close. The big difference is that SAG-AFTRA is asking for that 11% raise right away, which would increase the further raises in this contract, and the AMPTP is only offering 5%. SAG-AFTRA says that the proposed wage increases from the AMPTP would not account for inflation and would actually result in a pay decrease versus the terms of the 2020 contract 3 years ago. The AMPTP says that the 5% general wage increase is the most that actors would have received since the 1988 contract, and that their proposal would generate $717 million in wage increases over the 3-year contract. And again, this is just negotiation. I understand the inflation angle, so I think that they're probably going to be able to negotiate something above 5, but less than 11% for actors. But it does look like that there will be an historic pay increase for actors in the Guild if they go above that 5% mark, which I think that they will probably do. This is something that I'm actually pretty passionate about. Performance capture. SAG-AFTRA has requested that the producers recognize performance capture as a work category under the SAG-AFTRA agreement. Basically, there are certain categories, voiceover, acting on screen, etc., that are covered under the different agreements. Performance capture right now is not one of them. SAG-AFTRA basically is saying that, well, this is a very important thing. It's evolved into a huge tool that filmmakers use. It's what makes movies like Avatar possible. And the AMPTP just rejected that outright. And the only statement that they made was, quote, "The parties have a long-standing dispute about performance capture." So this is a case where it sounds like SAG-AFTRA says performance capture is essential to acting, and the producers are saying, yeah, we don't think that it is. And, you know, I hate to say this because I do think that performance capture is essential, but this also feels like something for me that the union may drop in negotiations in order to get an increase somewhere else. This has happened before. When the writers went on strike, for example, about 15 years ago, one of their big things was trying to get reality shows unionized so that reality writers would be part of the WGA. And in order to get the other things in that contract done, they dropped that provision, and reality was excluded from the WGA. And there was a lot of anger about that because many people wanted that to happen. But sometimes you have to drop something that you deem important in order to get something for everybody else. I think this performance capture provision feels like one of those things, unfortunately. Something I think we will see much more negotiation on is something called self-tape auditions. Basically, this is when actors, instead of going to a casting office or doing something on a Zoom to do an audition for a part, they record it at home using their own equipment and then send that recording off to a casting director. It was something that existed pre-COVID, but of course, during COVID, it was something that began to be used much, much more, and now SAG-AFTRA is looking for some kind of a regulation. SAG-AFTRA proposed a minimum turnaround time, excluding weekends and holidays. They also asked for a 5 4/8 page limit for any first audition for an actor. And yes, I said 5 4/8, not 5.5. That's just one of those industry things. Pages are measured in eighths, and you never cut that down. You never say 5 1/4 or 5.5. It's 5 4/8. But basically, SAG-AFTRA is saying don't make actors do more than 5.5. I'll say 5.5 pages of dialogue for a first audition, because that's a lot of stuff to try to figure out in your head and try to get a performance done around. SAG-AFTRA also asked for limitations on AV equipment to make sure that actors were not required to buy top-of-the-line equipment in order to do an audition. And this is a big one. They requested the availability of virtual or in-person auditions upon request of the actor. So if somebody asks for a self-tape and the actor says, I would prefer to do it virtually or in person, then the studios or the casting agencies would be obliged to grant that request. AMPTP's counteroffer was a minimum turnaround, but without exclusions for weekends and holidays. They also agreed to an 8 8-page limit as far as a first audition, but that memorization would not be required. There was a tentative agreement as far as equipment that actors are required to use, and then a sunset clause after 3 years on virtual or in-person requests. A sunset clause basically says, yes, we will agree to it, but we will also agree that this will end after this 3-year contract. SAG-AFTRA says that the turnaround times for auditions should include those exclusions, and they're not going to drop that demand. They also say that 8 pages is still too many for a first audition, and they also said that in-person auditions were only agreed upon on a first-come, first-served basis, and that the sunset clause is not acceptable. The AMPTP says that the 8-page limit on auditions came from their casting sources because that was the number they needed in order to get the scope of the performance for each actor auditioning. They also said that they included the sunset clause only to gauge the number of actors who were interested in virtual or in-person auditions, and that discussion around the topic could be renewed when SAG-AFTRA and AMPTP do this again in 3 years. And as you can see, there's already been some negotiation here. So we're going to get the minimum turnaround time. Maybe the actors will get that exclusion for holidays and weekends. They may have to give up the page limit exclusion, especially if the producers are saying like, listen, we're talking to casting directors. And I see that point, basically saying like, the casting directors need to see a certain amount of material in order to determine if an actor is right for a part. And if 8 pages is what they say that amount is, then I could see the actors giving way on that. And then the sunset clause, again, they may have to kind of grit their teeth and agree on the actor's side and basically say, listen, we'll get it done for 3 years. And then if we have to fight this fight again in 2026, then that's what we'll do. Perhaps the stickiest issue in the actor strike, and the one that we will cover last here, is streaming revenue. So there's residuals, which is what an actor gets based on how a show does. But this is a system that's being requested on top of that. And the actors are asking for the establishment of a revenue sharing system for actors appearing on streaming shows of 2%, which basically means that actors would get 2% of all streaming revenue. The AMPTP rejected that proposal and did not make a counteroffer. SAG-AFTRA says that this allows actors to share in the success of streaming shows, but the AMPTP says that the actors want to share in the reward, but not the risk. They say this 2% share is on top of existing residuals and based on a flat 2% of revenue that producers may not have rights to also claim. So the studios are basically saying, you want 2% of everything. Our producers may not even have contracts that allow them to share in 2% of all of the overall streaming revenue. So you're asking for more than we're even getting, and we're assuming all the risk as producers and studios. If a show flops, we're the ones that are losing money, but you're still getting a flat 2% of all the revenue that's coming in, whether a show is good or bad. Why should you not have to risk losing money if we are? This is something that they seem fundamentally apart on, and this is the thing that I'm going to be very curious to see what they figure out, because the way that Netflix deals with this and the way that Apple or the way that Disney or Warner Brothers or Sony, who doesn't even have a major streaming service, deals with this issue are going to be completely different. And I think that a lot of people are hoping that this could allow SAG-AFTRA and the Writers Guild to make separate deals and basically say like, well, you know, I know that you're all negotiating together, but guess what? Sony, Warner Brothers Discovery, and Disney and Paramount came to us with terms that we can agree with. So we're going to sign deals with all of those other studios. Everybody else, you can go kick rocks, you can keep negotiating, but we're going to go back to work for them. And that could put Netflix in a bind then to agree to terms that maybe they're not happy with, but they're the only terms that will get them back working again. It's going to be very interesting to see how this turns out. This is very similar to the new media stuff 15 years ago. I understand why the actors are drawing a line in the sand here, because this is an all new revenue stream that they're really negotiating for the first time. And if they give up too much ground this time, they may never get that ground back when it comes to streaming revenues. So this, I think, is going to be the thing that takes up the majority of the negotiating time. And quite frankly, I think that it's this issue that is a major reason why 2 guilds are on strike right now. Now, it wasn't all bad, because there are a few things that the guild and the producers have come to tentative agreements on, including a provision on diversity saying that consultations were agreed upon to cut down on instances of wigging and paint downs, which are common in stunt work. Wigging would be, for example, to put a wig on a male stunt performer to do the work that a female stunt performer could potentially do. And paint downs is pretty much the same thing. It is the altering of the skin color on a stunt performer to double for an actor who is of a different race than they are. so there were reportedly some provisions that were agreed upon to cut down on that or eliminate it altogether. There were also some tentative agreements around sexual harassment. Producers will work to engage intimacy coordinators for intimate scenes, and in addition, background actors will be given 48 hours notice for scenes involving nudity and or sex acts. When it comes to minors, emancipated minors will continue to receive an onset education, and the providers of that education will now be subject to a background check. Regarding unreleased projects, this was a proposal that was withdrawn by SAG-AFTRA. They initially asked studios to compensate actors for projects that were not released by studios in order to make up for lost residuals. Another dropped provision involved theatrical re-releases. SAG-AFTRA had asked that actors be compensated again for films that were re-released theatrically. So Titanic was released earlier this year in theaters. By this provision, then Leonardo DiCaprio and Kathy Bates and Kate Winslet would have been, and Billy Zane, of course, would have been compensated again for that film. That proposal was also dropped already by SAG-AFTRA. So as you can see, there is a lot still to do at the negotiating table, and there is no negotiating going on right now between the actors and the AMPTP. And it has been a very busy first 3 weeks of the strike with some very interesting stories that have popped up. One thing that is nice to see is that there has been support from a lot of the A-list actors. And that's something that, you know, in the comments and stuff, a lot of people said like, well, why should I care about the actor strike? A bunch of millionaires. That's like maybe 2 to 4% of all of the people that are in SAG-AFTRA. The vast majority of actors are not millionaires, and that's why they're on strike. So there has been support from prominent actors on the picket lines, although not as much as some people would have liked. And then some actors have also made donations to various funds. Word broke in the last week or so that George Clooney, Meryl Streep, and Dwayne Johnson all made $1 million plus contributions to the SAG-AFTRA fund, which helps actors in financial need during a strike. And Seth MacFarlane also donated over $1 million to the Entertainment Community Fund, which supports people in all areas of the arts in severe financial hardship. The Entertainment Community Fund, by the way, is also being supported by this channel. As I announced in a previous video, 5% of my ad revenue will be going to this fund for the duration of the strike, and you can find more information about the Entertainment Community Fund in the description of this video and every video, again, for the duration of the strike. One of the more amusing stories that's come up since the strike began is something called Treegate. Now, I don't think that the actors and writers that are out there striking in front of NBC Universal found this very amusing, but it's just one of those stories that could only happen during a strike. Early in the strike, NBC Universal was accused of malicious tree trimming after several trees outside their headquarters were pruned, reducing the shade available to picketing strikers. After an investigation, and yes, there was an actual investigation, the city of Los Angeles fined NBC $250 because those trees were under city management and they did not get an approval to trim the trees back. Now, of course, the actors and writers on strike accused the studio of intentionally trimming the trees to make it a more uncomfortable situation for them picketing outside during a very hot summer. But NBC Universal denied that. They said in a statement, quote, "We understand that the safety tree trimming of the ficus trees that we did on Bar and Boulevard has created unintended challenges for demonstrators. That was not our intention. In partnership with licensed arborists, we have pruned these trees annually at this time of year to ensure that the canopies are light ahead of the high wind season. We support the WGA and SAG's right to demonstrate and are working to provide some shade coverage. We continue to openly communicate with the labor leaders on site to work together at this time." To their credit, NBC Universal did later put up some tents on the sidewalk to provide shade for the picketers. But this is one of those things that, you know, again, only during a strike season would the trimming of trees in front of a studio become a multi-day story in all of the trades and generate all of this controversy and have a city inspector have to come out and do an investigation. It's just crazy. Maybe it is that Universal trimmed those trees at a very inopportune time. It is pretty coincidental that it was the first week of the strike, but, you know, sometimes timing is everything, I guess. Being on strike, obviously, very difficult for the actors and writers and for the people in the associated industries, the makeup artists, the key grips, people that can't work because nothing is shooting right now. But it's also been a very troubling time and a confusing time for influencers, people that work on YouTube and on social media, because there's been a bit of a gray area as far as what they are allowed to do and not allowed to do. Some influencers are a part of SAG-AFTRA, but not the part of SAG-AFTRA that's on strike. Other influencers are part of SAG-AFTRA and are working for studios that are struck companies, and then there are other influencers that aren't part of SAG-AFTRA, but maybe would one day want to join the union, and nobody really seems to know what to do. Because early in the strike, SAG-AFTRA issued what they called guidelines for influencers. It said, and this was a fairly easy provision, that influencers should not accept any new work for promotion or struck companies or their content. Existing contract work should be completed. This one was fairly easy. It basically means if you're in SAG-AFTRA and Disney comes to you and says, hey, I want to pay you $1,500 to promote Haunted Mansion after the strike was called, then you say no because you're on strike against that company. But if Disney paid you $1,500 to promote Haunted Mansion before the strike was called, then you could complete that existing contract. Where it got a little messy was further down in those provisions, because SAG-AFTRA also said, quote, influencers should refrain from posting on social media about any struck work, regardless of whether they are posting organically or in a paid capacity. They also said, quote, you cannot participate in conventions such as Comic-Con on behalf of or to promote companies we are striking against. You may participate in a convention in ways that are wholly independent of characters from struck work. And then they said, quote, any non-member seeking future membership in SAG-AFTRA who performs covered work or services for a struck company during the strike will not be admitted into membership in SAG-AFTRA. And this opened up a whole can of worms because it had people asking, number one, what counts as promotion? There were a lot of people that were telling me that movie reviews counted as promotion. I disagree. I think that movie reviews are much closer to journalism. They are critique. They do not exist to promote a film. If the studios choose to use those reviews to promote a film, they can, but that's not the reason for them being there. It's to start a discussion about movies, but it was never codified. It was never said basically like, here are the specific things you can do and the specific things you can't do. And when they say you can't promote anything paid or organically, well, what is an organic social media post about a movie? If you say, hey, I went and saw Barbie, or I can't wait for Oppenheimer, is that an organic post about a movie? Does that count as promotion? If there's an influencer that wants to be in SAG-AFTRA, they're now worried that tweeting, I loved Ryan Gosling and Barbie, that SAG-AFTRA may go back in 3 years and say, look, you were performing promotion for a struck work during the strike. I'm sorry you can't get in. There were cosplayers when Comic-Con came and went that said, I'm in SAG-AFTRA, or I want to be in SAG-AFTRA, and I want to go dressed as, Jean Grey, or I want to go dressed as Harley Quinn or Wolverine because I love that character. But they say that you can't go to conventions as a related character to a struck project. Well, does that mean that I can't do my cosplay at Comic-Con? Will I be kicked out of the union or not allowed to be in the union if I do my cosplay? The gray area is so vast here, and people have so many questions, and SAG-AFTRA really doesn't seem too concerned with answering those questions. I understand they have bigger fish to fry, but I think that they wanted to include the larger internet because they know that there is great promotional capacity in the internet, but they did not delineate exactly what people should or shouldn't be doing. And I think that they've really made things hard for a lot of people and left them out in the cold. So if I were going to give a feedback form once this whole strike is over, I would say that you seem to value influencers for what they could do for you, but you didn't really go out of your way to make life a little bit easier for them as far as providing some guidance into what was allowed and what was not allowed. And there's been even more controversy around actual SAG-AFTRA members, actors who have been allowed to work via something that's called an interim agreement. Now, this is not what some people call it, which is a waiver. A waiver would have said, hey, we're exempting you from the strike. You can go to work, and the thing that you're working on is also exempt from what's happening with the strike. That's not what these are. Interim agreements are basically an independent production. Now, how you define that, we'll talk about in a moment, but a movie or a TV show that's being produced by an independent production company at least, and it basically says that we are agreeing as a movie or a show to abide by what you are currently asking for from the AMPTP, and we also agree to whatever the final terms of these contract negotiations will be. What this allows an independent film or show to do is to stay in production and to use SAG-AFTRA actors in that production. So it's a clearance for the project. It's also a clearance for the actors in that project to continue working on it. Some prominent projects that have received interim agreements to use SAG-AFTRA actors during the strike include The Chosen, the crowd-funded show about the life of Jesus, released by Angel Studios, who currently have Sound of Freedom in theaters. theaters now. A24, which as a reminder is not a part of the AMPTP, got an interim agreement for Death of a Unicorn, produced by Ari Aster, starring Paul Rudd and Jenna Ortega, which is now filming in Hungary. A horror thriller produced by Sam Raimi called Don't Move was given an interim agreement to continue production. Flight Risk, Mel Gibson's latest film starring Mark Wahlberg, was given an interim agreement to continue, as was a film called G20 starring Viola Davis, but there was some controversy because G20 already has distribution through Amazon. And this is where a lot of people have raised red flags, because many films are, yes, being produced by independent companies, but they have already gotten distribution through a struck company like Amazon. And so many people that are on strike are saying like, well, wait a minute. If you already have distribution for Amazon, then what's the difference between going to work for Amazon and not going to work for Amazon? And many people thought it was a loophole. And in the case of this movie, Viola Davis, who's the star of the movie, made her own decision not to continue production on the film. So even though the film was granted an interim agreement to continue production, she said, out of solidarity with my actors, I do not feel that this is the right time for me to continue work on this project. So it's still basically shut down anyway, at least as far as anything concerning Viola Davis. So getting this interim agreement does not necessarily mean that the movie or show is going to go into production, because you have to have actors that agree to also continue working. Another A24 film, Mother Mary, David Lowery's new film, a musical starring Anne Hathaway and Michaela Cole, was also given an interim agreement. Please Don't Feed the Children, the directorial debut of Destry Alan Spielberg, was given an interim agreement to continue casting. Another controversial agreement that SAG-AFTRA allowed was for Apple TV Plus's Tehran, because it defied the seemingly strict rule that any tie to an AMPTP entity is a deal breaker. Tehran is a show that's already aired episodes on Apple TV Plus. This is not its first season, but it is produced by an independent production company, and that production company has agreed to those terms. So what SAG-AFTRA basically is saying, like, well, yes, it's on Apple TV Plus, but the production company is agreeing to the terms, so it doesn't really count. Again, this has been an argument between different people as to whether this should be allowed or not. So there are really two sides to this whole interim agreement thing. SAG-AFTRA has said that they encourage actors to go back to work under these interim agreements, because they say the more producers of these independent projects that agree to the terms, the harder it is for the studios that are still holding out to say, well, these terms are unreasonable, because they can say, really? Because we have 150 projects right over here that have agreed to our current terms. So if these little tiny movies can agree to these terms, then why can't you as companies that are much, much bigger? And that's something else. Yes, a lot of these are big name stars and big name movies, but the majority of movies and shows that are under these interim agreements are truly independent. They don't have distribution. They don't have big name stars. So SAG-AFTRA is saying that the more actors working under these agreements, the better, because it proves just how reasonable their terms are. But there are many people, even inside of the union, striking actors, who say that it's a bad look to have so many actors working during a strike, because especially if some of these projects are getting distribution on some of the platforms, then it undermines the strike. And if so many projects are still being worked on, then it really helps those studios kind of weather the storm, and then it creates basically a system of haves and have-nots, where you have crew members and actors, the majority of which are out of work, except for the select few who are able to get interim agreements, and that it's much better to have solidarity on this issue. And I can honestly see this issue for both sides. I do think that these interim agreements should be given to films that are truly independent. Chris Stuckman's film, for example, which he's been making for a while now, I saw applied for one of these waivers, and I don't know if they received it. The last time I checked, they had not. But this is a film that I think should be allowed to continue work, because a lot of these are low-budget films. If you have these big delays where they have to stop down production, many of them won't recover. Those movies just aren't going to happen. But I disagree with giving waivers to things like Tehran on Apple TV Plus, or really any project that already has distribution on a major platform, because that's just another thing that keeps them on track. And the whole goal of this is to completely derail everything that the studios are doing. That's your leverage. So I agree with what some of SAG-AFTRA is doing here with these interim agreements, and I disagree with a lot of the other things that they're doing. And I think that that's what led actors like Viola Davis to walk away from her movie, because they said, yes, technically we may be able to keep making this movie, but it is a bad look for me in my position to still be working when so many other people, especially people that have less than I do, are out on the picket lines. This is just one of those decisions that actors have to make for themselves. Now, some late breaking news as of this week, and something that I'm glad I was able to include in this video, was the news that after a 3-month stalemate, that the WGA, the Writers Guild of America, and the AMPTP will be returning to the negotiating tables starting on Friday. Reportedly, it was the studios that reached out to the writers and said that they were ready to begin negotiations again. And now the question remains, will they be able to find any kind of agreement on the issues that they're facing? And I did a whole video breaking down the writer's strike, but just a quick recap when we're talking about what's on the table for the WGA. Much like SAG-AFTRA, they're asking for an increase in minimum payments for each year for the next 3 years. They're asking for payment on second step work, which is basically rewrites and revisions. They want a guaranteed minimum writing staff size for episodic shows and a guaranteed length of employment for writers on episodic shows. This is essentially to get rid of the mini room trend that has popped up over the last several years. The writers are also asking for a revised global residual system based on global subscriber numbers and the establishment of a residual system for streaming based on viewership. Much like with the actors, this has been a huge point of contention. And then the writers are asking for a ban on the use of artificial intelligence to generate material, to generate source material for writers to work from, and a ban on the use of their work to train AI on how to write material. The writers and the producers sitting down is objectively good news. It means that the temperature has dropped a little bit, and I think part of it is that as far as the PR goes, it's been pretty disastrous for the producer side since the actor strike began, really. First, there was the anonymous quote in Deadline that basically said the producers intend to starve, literally starve the writers out until they're losing their homes and force them to make a bad deal. That energized everybody on the picket lines. And then there was Bob Iger's comments regarding the strike, where he said that the strikers' demands were not realistic. That put a face to the anger that so many people had for all the studios. Iger himself has not been an active part of the negotiations, at least not directly. He's been sending other top executives from Disney, perhaps in an attempt to keep his face away and to keep the tension down. Now, I don't want to throw any cold water on this because this is great news, but keep in mind that during the last writer's strike, which happened in 2007 and 2008, the writers and producers went back to the negotiating table about 3 weeks after the strike began. Talks broke down about 2 weeks later. It took 6 weeks for talks to begin again, and then another 3 weeks for a deal to be hammered out that everybody was happy with. So the expectation that they'll be able to sit down at the table on Friday and that we could have a deal potentially by next week, that would be great. And I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but history says that this is still going to be a protracted process of talks, that talks may break down again, and there may be another period where talks aren't happening. And so, I don't want anyone to get their hopes up too much that we are near the end of this writer's strike. There is, however, one big difference between this strike and the last writer's strike, which is that it has been 3 months since anybody sat down at the table instead of just a few weeks, which means that both sides have probably been able to get together and perhaps come up with more comprehensive proposals as far as what they're willing to negotiate on, and perhaps that will shorten these negotiations. That's also a possibility. We just don't quite know what's going to happen. But again, objectively, it is very good that these negotiations are happening with the writers and the producers, because I think once a deal is made with the writers, then hopefully the actors shouldn't be too far behind and everybody can get back to work. SAG-AFTRA leadership has said that there has been no communication from the AMPTP since they walked out on July 12th. And, I really wish that there was some authority that could at least keep these parties at the table and negotiating. Even if the strike still lasted 3 months, it would be good to know that somebody was there negotiating this entire time, because this has been so damaging to so many people inside, outside the industry, not just in Hollywood, by the way, around the country. I have a good friend of mine that works on a lot of stuff not in Hollywood, who has been out of work for a while, and he may actually not be able to make it to my wedding later this year, because if this strike keeps going and keeps going, he's got a family to think about, and it's a cost that he just can't afford. And we've already talked about it, and I said, absolutely, I understand. I mean, I want you there, but your family comes first. So this is affecting real people and real families. And I know that there is some sort of a power play that comes with, well, you didn't call me, I called you. And well, we're going to let them sit and stew for 6 weeks because, we want to show that we're the bigger person. Let's get past all that. It's ridiculous. This is playground stuff. This is kid stuff. let's get to the table. Let's sit down. Let's negotiate. I hope that the producers are serious about these negotiations with the writers. I do hope that an equitable deal is struck in very short order, and then nobody should go home. The writers should walk out the door, and the actors should walk in the door, and let's just get this thing done. Let's not pretend that a deal that's made in 3 months is going to be that substantially different than a deal that's made in 3 weeks with the same amount of negotiation. Let's check the egos. Let's get back to work. The industry is coming back. We had one of the best months ever, one of the best weekends ever with Barbie and Oppenheimer, and I'm not saying you can replicate that, but if this goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks, then the entertainment industry is basically forcing itself into a redo of 2020, which is one of the worst periods that we have ever had in the entertainment industry, and they're still trying to recover from. This thing I did at the top of the show, this movie's pushed its release date, this movie's delayed 6 months, this movie's delayed 10 months. It's like the pandemic all over again, but it's entirely self-inflicted by, it seems like, the producers not wanting to come to the table and negotiate here. I'm not saying that anybody is 100% in the right or 100% in the wrong, but you've got to sit down and start making this deal. I love that the writers are going back. I hope that the actors are going back soon. And of course, right here on the channel, I will continue to track all of this. I'm hoping I have another update for you very soon. I don't want it to be another 6 weeks or 2 months before I have another strike update. If there is major strike news to tell you, then I will be right here on the channel to give you those updates. If there's a deal, I'll try to break down those terms as best I can. Thank you so much for watching this video. Stay tuned later this week. I'll have a review of Meg 2, The Trench, and I'm working on a couple of other fun things. And of course, next week, we'll be talking about the box office on Charts with Dan and so much more. Until next time, stay safe. If you're out there picketing, try to stay cool, stay hydrated, and I'll see you soon. Bye.